The hands tell the story first. Before you know her name, before you understand what she lost or what she found, look at the hands. Calloused along the palm where a trowel sits. Scarred at the knuckle from months of work that no one expected her to do. Nails that will never be completely clean again, no matter how long she scrubs. These are the hands of a woman who spent the worst year of her life rebuilding something everyone else had written off as worthless. These hands are pressed flat against a timber wall in the darkness of a ruined house deep in the Vermont woods at 2 in the morning in November, in the kind of cold that finds the spaces between your bones. The woman standing in that darkness is 70 years old. Her name is Martha Eleanor Jenkins, and she is home. She does not know yet in this opening moment everything that this place will give her. She does not know about the wooden crate hidden above the ceiling she is standing under, or the man who built this house with his own hands in 1871 and hid his life's work inside it, or the discovery waiting in that darkness that has waited 150 years for someone with the right kind of patience to find it. She does not know that everything she lost will be the reason she found this. She only knows that the timber beneath her palm is old-growth white oak, cut and fitted by someone who understood that the difference between a house that lasts 50 years and a house that lasts 150 is entirely a matter of how seriously you take the work. She knows this because her husband Robert was a carpenter who talked about wood the way poets talk about light, and because 40 years of listening had taught her more than she ever expected to retain. She knows that whoever built this house cared about it. She says this out loud quietly to no one. You built well, I'll try to do the same. Then the story steps back 3 days to where it actually begins on a sidewalk in Burlington, Vermont, on a cold morning in November when Martha Jenkins' world came apart in the way that the worst things always do, quietly and completely and without warning. Martha was born in 1949 in Burlington, the daughter of a seamstress and a hardware store owner. Her mother's hands were precise and patient. Her father's hands were practical and strong. Between the two of them, they had given her something more useful than either trait in isolation, the understanding that problems were things you worked through rather than around, and that the quality of your character was most visible, not in your best moments, but in how you behaved when you had nothing left. She had met Robert Jenkins in 1972 at a church social, which neither of them had particularly wanted to attend, and both of them would remember for the rest of their lives as the best decision they ever made, reluctantly. Robert was a carpenter who built furniture and cabinets, and in later years custom homes for people who wanted things made to last. He had the particular serenity of a man who spends his days in honest physical work and goes home at night knowing exactly what he accomplished. Martha had loved him for 37 years before cancer took him in 2016, and she had loved him during those years with the steady, uncomplicated devotion of someone who understood that what she had was rare and therefore worth the full measure of her attention. They had raised 2 children in the house on Maple Street in Burlington. Michael, now 45, was a property developer in Boston, successful, uncertain, and slightly impatient with things that moved at a pace other than his own. Susan, now 42, was an attorney in Hartford Sharp and organized and possessed of the particular efficiency of a woman who has learned to compress her emotional life into whatever space is left after professional obligations have been met. Martha loved both of them in the way that mothers love children they raise completely and without conditions, which is different from saying she always understood them. Robert had left Martha the house on Maple Street when he died. It was paid off. It was hers. It held 40 years of their life together in every room, the kitchen where she had taught the children to cook, the backyard, where Robert had built a workshop that still smelled of sawdust and linseed oil, the bedroom where they had talked every night before sleep with the easy continuity of 2 people who have never run out of things to say to each other. After Robert died, Martha had stayed. The house was difficult to maintain on her Social Security income of $1,200 a month. The roof needed work. The furnace was aging. Property taxes kept rising. But it was home. It was the only home she had known for 4 decades. She was not ready to leave it. 6 months before the morning everything fell apart, she had signed the house over to her children. Michael had suggested it at a family dinner in the reasonable, organized voice he used when he had already decided something and was presenting it as a conversation. Mom, if something happens to you, this makes everything simpler. No probate, no delays, no legal complications. We're family. We'll take care of you. Martha had looked across the table at her son and felt briefly the small hesitation of a woman who has lived long enough to know that practical arrangements made in the name of simplicity are not always as simple as they are presented. She thought about what Robert would have said, which was that he would have asked several specific questions about the legal language before signing anything. But Robert was not there. And Martha was tired and lonely in the particular way of people who have recently lost the person they talk to about everything, and she had trusted her children with the more complicated and irreversible decisions of her own life before this, and it had always been fine. She signed. On November 3rd, 2019, Michael and Susan arrived at the Maple Street house without calling first. They brought a real estate agent. Martha was in the garden when she heard the car. She had been deadheading the roses Robert had planted in his last healthy summer, the ones she had tended since because they were his and she could not bear to let them go to disorder. She stood up from the garden bed and saw her children's faces as they came across the lawn toward her, and she understood before a word was spoken that something had been decided without her. Michael spoke first. He was always the one who spoke first. He sat her down in her own living room and explained in careful, measured language that the house was too much for her to maintain alone, that she was 70 years old, that the winters were hard and the house was large and the worry was constant, that they had found a facility in Burlington Sunrise Gardens with its own room, 3 meals, daily activities, medical staff on site. Susan produced a brochure. The room in the brochure was small and bright and impersonal in the way of rooms designed to be described as comfortable. The monthly cost was $3,000, more than twice Martha's income. How would I pay for it? Martha asked quietly. We've talked to a buyer, Michael said. He's offering $485,000. We'll use that to cover the costs. You'll be taken care of. Martha sat with this for a moment. You're selling my home, she said. It's our house now, Susan said, and her voice had an edge in it that Martha had never heard before, something that had been waiting for permission to emerge. You signed it over to us. We're making the decision that's best for everyone. Best for everyone, Martha repeated. She heard her own voice as if from a small distance, steady in the way that voices are sometimes steady when something very large has happened and the full weight of it has not yet arrived. Or best for you. You're becoming a burden, Michael said. The word landed in the room with the particular finality of something that has been thought for a long time and is only now being said aloud. We have our own families, our own responsibilities. We can't keep worrying about you out here alone. Martha had not known she was a burden. She had not asked her children for money or time or the particular costly labor of worry. She had asked for nothing except what all people ask of the people they raised, which is to be loved, which she had believed until this moment was being given. I never asked you to worry about me, she said. I've taken care of myself since your father died. And now you can't, Susan said. The house sells in 2 weeks. You need to be packed and ready. If I refuse, Martha asked. The house is legally ours, Michael said. If you refuse to leave, we'll have to pursue other options. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be. They left. They did not stay for the tea Martha had put on before they arrived when she had still believed this was a regular visit. The real estate agent walked through the rooms making notes on a clipboard, evaluating each space with the practiced gaze of someone who measures worth in square footage and market comparables. Martha sat alone in the living room for a long time after they were gone. The real estate agent continued his walk through his footsteps, moving room to room above her, measuring and noting and calculating. She heard him open the bedroom closet. She heard him in the bathroom. She heard him on the stairs. She did not move. She sat in the chair Robert had built for her 20 years ago, the one with the slightly wider armrests because he had noticed she always rested her elbows when she read, and she sat in the particular way of a person whose body has understood something that the mind is still processing. Her children had planned this, not impulsively, not in a sudden decision made under pressure. They had found a buyer. They had visited the facility. They had prepared documentation. This had been arranged over weeks, perhaps months, while she had continued her daily life tending the roses and baking bread and believing she still had a home. She thought about the dinner 8 months ago when Michael had suggested the joint ownership arrangement. She thought about how she had looked at the prepared documents and felt a small hesitation that she had dismissed because she was tired of being suspicious of her own children. She had been right to feel the hesitation. She had been wrong to dismiss it. She thought about Robert. She thought about what he would say and what he would not say. He would not say, "I told you so," because he had not told her so, because he had not known, and because he was not a man who said things to prove points. He would sit beside her in his own chair, the one he had built at the same time as hers, so the heights matched and they could always sit at the same level, and he would be quiet for as long as was needed. And then he would say, "All right, what's next?" "All right," Martha said aloud to the empty room. "What's next?" She went upstairs and began to pack. She had $50.38 in her wallet. Her monthly Social Security check had gone to utilities and groceries and the usual necessities of a woman living carefully within her means. She packed what she could carry because she had nowhere to take anything larger. She was deliberate about what she chose. Not the most valuable things in the material sense. The things that contained Robert and her mother and her grandmother and the 40 years that had happened in this house. Clothes enough for one bag folded neatly because her mother had taught her that neatness was a form of respect for your own belongings. A box of photographs. The small gold cross her mother had worn every day of her adult life, the one that had been pressed into Martha's palm at the funeral, with the wordless certainty of a woman passing something forward. Robert's wristwatch with the leather strap he had replaced twice because he wore it every day and never intended to stop. The Bible her grandmother had given her at her confirmation in 1963 with the pressed flowers from her wedding bouquet, still inside it, dried to the color of old paper, still faintly holding a shape. She moved through the house one last time. The kitchen where she had taught the children to cook and where she had stood for 40 years, making the meals that held a family together in all the invisible ways that meals do. The bedroom where she had slept beside Robert for 37 years, where she had told him everything worth telling. The backyard where his workshop still stood smelling of sawdust and linseed oil. The smell of him so present in that space that she could not enter it without a particular catching in her chest. She stood at the door of the workshop and did not go in. She said goodbye to it from the threshold. Everything else, the dishes from their wedding, the quilts she had sewn over 30 years of winter evenings, the furniture Robert had built by hand for each room of the house, the garden he had planted, and she had tended the 40 years of accumulated ordinary life that could not fit in a broken suitcase she left behind. On the morning of November 15th, the moving crew arrived at 8. Michael and Susan did not come. They sent the movers with instructions and a text message. "Hope everything goes smoothly. We love you, Mom." Martha read the text message twice. Then she put her phone in her coat pocket and went downstairs to watch the movers work. They were efficient and impersonal in the way of professional movers who have emptied hundreds of houses and have learned to do the work without engaging with what the work means to the people whose lives they are dismantling. They wrapped the furniture in pads, loaded the boxes, carried out the pieces Robert had built. She watched them carry out the kitchen table, the one he had built the second year they were in the house because the one they had bought did not suit him and he had taken it apart and started again. She watched them carry out the chair from the living room, his chair. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say. The foreman gave her a form to sign at the end. She signed it. He handed her a carbon copy. She took it. At 10:30, Martha Jenkins stood on the sidewalk outside the house on Maple Street with 2 cardboard boxes, 1 broken suitcase held together with twine, and $56.38 to her name. She was 70 years old. She had no home. The facility her children had arranged required a deposit she could not pay and a guarantor she did not have. The text message on her phone said they loved her. She was in the most literal sense she had ever experienced alone. Cars drove past without stopping. Neighbors she had known for decades had things to do. The movers finished their work and drove away without a word. Martha sat down on her suitcase in the November cold and tried to understand what she was supposed to do next. She had never in her life sat on a sidewalk not knowing what to do next. She had been a girl who made plans and a young woman who kept them, and a middle-aged woman who adjusted them, and a widow who rebuilt around their absence. She was not a person who sat on curbs. She was not sure how long she sat there before the newspaper caught her eye. That was when she noticed the newspaper in the trash can at the curb. Someone had discarded that morning's Burlington Free Press. A small notice in the classified section caught her eye, the kind of notice that looks like nothing until you are the exact person who needs it. Chittenden County Government Auction. Condemned and tax delinquent properties. November 15th, 2019. 2 p.m. County Administration Building. Minimum bid $1. Cash or money order only. All properties sold as is. Today, 2 o'clock, the county building was 6 blocks from where she was sitting. Martha folded the newspaper carefully and put it in her coat pocket. She looked at the house that had been her home. She looked at the $56. She thought about Robert, who had spent his life building things, and what he would have said to her now if he could have said anything at all. He would have said, "You have two hands and a backbone, and that's more than most people start with." She picked up her suitcase and her boxes and started walking. The 6 blocks to the county building were the longest 6 blocks of her life, and also in retrospect, the most clarifying. She was a 70-year-old woman with a broken suitcase and less than $60 walking through downtown Burlington on a November morning with nowhere to be except a government auction for condemned properties, and she felt something she had not expected to feel clear. The fog of the morning, the numb shock of the moving crew, and the text message and the sidewalk was lifting, replaced by the particular crispness that comes when a situation has resolved itself into its simplest terms. She had a problem. The problem required a solution. She was going to find one. It was the same feeling she had when a difficult recipe went wrong and needed rescuing, when the quilt pattern she was working from turned out to have an error in the third row, and she had to calculate the correction. It was the feeling of a capable woman who has been given a problem and has decided without fanfare to solve it. The county administration building was a low brick structure that smelled of old paperwork and institutional patience. Martha arrived at 1:45, dragging the broken suitcase the cardboard boxes balanced on top. The auction was in a basement conference room, fluorescent lit and cold. 30 people were already there, mostly men in their 40s and 50s, with the particular confidence of people who know what they are doing in a room like this. They looked at Martha when she came in. She was aware of being looked at and found it irrelevant. She found a folding chair in the back corner, settled her suitcase under it, and her boxes beside it, took out the newspaper notice and read it again carefully. She was not here to be seen. She was here to buy something. Their expressions were not unkind. They simply made the fast, efficient calculation that people make in competitive rooms, and they concluded that she was not competition. The auctioneer was a heavy man named Donald Pierce, who had been running county auctions for 15 years and had developed the delivery of someone who wants to be done with proceedings by 5 o'clock. He opened at 2 o'clock precisely and moved through the first 21 properties at a pace that suggested he had dinner plans. Properties sold for $8,000, $38,000, $45,000. The investors bid with precision. Martha watched and learned how it worked because she had always learned things by watching carefully before acting. Property number 22 was the last one that mattered. Pierce looked at his notes and paused for just a half second. The pause of a man who has seen a lot and is briefly uncertain how to present what he is about to present. Property 22, he said, located at the end of Timber Ridge Road, approximately 12 miles outside the city limits. Single-family structure, approximately 1,200 square feet. Construction date estimated 1870. Abandoned for approximately 15 years. No functioning electrical service. No running water. No septic system. Significant roof damage. All windows broken. Foundation issues. Extensive mold throughout. He stopped. The room was already beginning to chuckle. The county inspector has condemned the property as uninhabitable and recommends demolition. Access is via an unpaved forestry road impassable in winter. And according to the September inspection report, there is an active family of raccoons living in what used to be the kitchen. The room laughed, real laughter, the laughter of professionals who recognize a joke even when it is also a fact. Pierce smiled. 2.3 acres of heavily forested land. Who wants to start the bidding at $1? Silence. Come on, folks. The raccoons are part of the deal. More laughter. No hands. $5, Martha said from the back of the room. The laughter stopped. Every head turned. Pierce found her with his eyes and held her gaze for a moment. Ma'am, I want to make sure you understand what you're bidding on. This property has been condemned. It is not legally habitable. The road may be impassable within the next few weeks. I understand, Martha said. A man near the front turned in his chair. Lady, that place is a death trap. You're 70 years old. You wouldn't last a night out there. Martha looked at him. I've been told that before, she said. About other things. The man had no response to this. Any other bids? Pierce asked the room. $6, anyone. Silence. A condemned structure 12 miles from town on a dirt road with raccoons in the kitchen was not an opportunity anyone in that room was willing to bid against a 70-year-old woman to obtain. Going once at $5, Pierce said. He paused, and in the pause there was something that might have been reluctance, the pause of a man with a conscience doing his job anyway. Going twice. Another pause. Sold to the lady in the back. Martha walked to the front of the room and placed 5 single-dollar bills on the table. The room watched her do it. No one laughed this time. Pierce signed the transfer documents, looked at her over his reading glasses and said, "Ma'am, are you certain about this?" "I have never been more certain of anything," Martha said. She collected the large envelope containing her deed, her survey maps, her property documents. She picked up her suitcase and her boxes. She walked out of the county building while 30 real estate investors watched her go. Outside, she sat on a bench and opened the envelope. She read through the documents the way Robert had always read documents, completely and carefully, looking at every line. The property history form noted at the top of the ownership chain, original owner Thomas W. Whitmore, 1870. Martha looked at the name. Something about it pulled at a memory she could not quite locate. Whitmore, she had seen that name somewhere recently, not in a context she could immediately place, but somewhere in it had carried weight. She tucked the envelope under her arm, picked up her things, and went to find a way to Timber Ridge Road. Frank Morrison was locking up his general store at the edge of town when Martha arrived, exhausted and carrying more than she should have been carrying for a woman of 70 on a November afternoon. He was a retired science teacher, 68 years old, with the unhurried manner of someone who has decided that most things that need doing can be done without rushing. He looked at Martha the way practical people look at situations that require a decision. "You bought the old Whitmore place," he said. It was not quite a question. "Word travels," Martha said. "In a town this size, a bid like yours travels in about an hour." He looked at her suitcase and boxes. "You heading out there now?" "I am." He studied her for a moment, then he said, "My truck's around back. I go that way." He drove her out. The road deteriorated from paved to gravel to two tire tracks through dense forest branches, scraping the sides of the truck, the headlights catching birch trunks, pale as bones in the November dark. The clearing when they reached it was small, and the house at its center was exactly as condemned as advertised. The roof sagged at the center and had a hole on the right side large enough to see sky through. Every window was broken to its frame. The front door hung from one hinge. Vines had grown up through cracks in the siding. One corner of the porch had collapsed entirely. The whole structure leaned slightly northeast, as though the forest had been applying pressure for decades and intended to continue. Frank let out a slow breath. "That's what $5 buys." "That's what $5 buys," Martha agreed and got out of the truck. She walked to the nearest wall and pressed both palms flat against the siding. Soft damage rotted through in places. She pressed harder, but beneath the siding something did not move. She pulled the damaged material aside far enough to see the framing underneath. Old-growth white oak, dry solid true. Robert had taught her this. Beneath the damage, look for the bones. If the bones are good, the rest is work. If the bones are bad, walk away. The bones of this house were good, better than good. They were the bones of something built by someone who took the work seriously. Frank helped her tarp the worst of the roof hole, secured it with rope tied to exposed beams. He left her a battery lantern, a bottle of water, and a $20 bill that she tried to refuse, and he pressed into her hand without discussion. "I come out this way every few days," he said. "I'll check on you." "Thank you," Martha said. She meant it entirely. After his taillights disappeared through the trees, Martha stood alone in the clearing. The wind moved through the pines with a sound like water. The house creaked. From somewhere inside came the indignant chittering of raccoons who had not been consulted about the change in ownership. She clicked on the lantern and walked into her house. The light revealed the full extent of what she had purchased. Decades of accumulated debris on the floor, leaves and branches and animal nests, and the black stain of mold on every wall. The kitchen area had an ancient cast iron stove, rusted but structurally present. A crude wooden table against one wall had survived the years with more dignity than most of the rest. From the ceiling corner, 4 pairs of eyes gleamed back at her, a mother raccoon and 3 babies thoroughly unimpressed. "This is my house now," Martha said aloud. Her voice was steady. "But you can stay for tonight. Tomorrow we'll need to make different arrangements." The raccoon chattered back at her. Martha almost smiled. She had been called a burden. She had been evicted from her own home. She had been laughed at by a room full of strangers. And here she was standing in a condemned house in the Vermont woods at 70 years old, negotiating tenancy with a raccoon. She realized, and never felt less like a burden in her life. She spent an hour clearing a space on the floor, sweeping debris toward the door with a pine branch she found outside. She laid out her coat as a ground cloth. She opened her box and took out Robert's watch and her grandmother's Bible and set them carefully beside her, the 2 things she had brought that were not practical, but that she could not have left behind. She ate the last of a granola bar from her coat pocket. She drank the water Frank had left. She lay down on her coat under her blanket and looked up at the tarped ceiling and the broken rafters and the dark sky she could see in the gap at the edge. She was cold. The single blanket was not enough against the November air coming through every crack and opening in the walls. Her back ached from the hard floor. Her hands were already scratched and dirty from the work of clearing the space. She lay in the dark and let herself feel all of it, the cold and the ache and the absurdity and the fear. She did not resist any of it. She had learned in the months of Robert's illness that resistance was not the same as strength, that sometimes strength meant allowing yourself to feel the full weight of something without letting it flatten you. She felt the full weight of it. She was 70 years old. She was lying on the floor of a condemned house in the Vermont woods with less than $50 to her name. Her children had taken her home and her dignity in the same morning and had not even been present to watch. She had spent 40 years building a life and 40 minutes packing it into 2 cardboard boxes. She felt all of this, and it was real, and it was heavy. And then she thought Robert built furniture from wood that other people had thrown out as scrap. He had always said that the things people discarded as worthless were often the most interesting things to work with because they came without assumptions about what they were supposed to become. You could see what they actually were. She looked up at the tarped ceiling and the broken rafters and the small piece of dark sky visible at the edge of the gap. This house had been thrown out. It had been condemned and laughed at and considered worthless. It was structurally sound beneath the damage. It had been built by someone who took the work seriously. She had been called a burden. She had been discarded by her own children. She was beneath everything that had been done to her today herself. A woman who had survived grief and raised children and kept a house and a garden and a 40-year marriage. A woman who knew how to do things with her hands. Not hope exactly. Something quieter and more durable than hope. The knowledge that what happened next depended entirely on her, which was frightening. And also she was surprised to discover a relief. My house, she said quietly to the dark and the raccoons, and the memory of Robert, and whoever had built this place and left it to be found. My home, I'm going to make it worth something. In the kitchen corner, the raccoon shifted and resettled and made a sound that might have been skepticism and might have been acknowledgement. Martha closed her eyes and slept. The first morning arrived without warmth. Martha woke at dawn to cold that had settled into her bones during the hours of restless half-sleep. Her breath made small clouds in the air. The thin blanket had been completely insufficient, and she had compensated by curling tightly around herself, which had preserved some warmth but had done nothing for her back. She sat up, slowly took inventory the way Robert had always taken inventory of a job site before beginning, not cataloging the problems but assessing what was there to work with. She was cold but functional. She had $51 remaining. She had Robert's watch, which meant she always knew what time it was. She had a box of matches and a battery lantern. She had a house with serious surface damage and good bones, which was more than most people had to start with. She opened the small notebook she had packed at the last minute, the one Robert had used to sketch furniture plans, and wrote in it by lantern light, Day 1. What needs doing in order? Water, food, heat, the house, work. She looked at the list. Then she added a line below it, smaller than the rest. Find out who Thomas W. Whitmore was. It did not belong on a survival list. She left it anyway. Water came first. She spent the early morning exploring the property and found a creek running fast and clear over stones about 200 yards down the slope behind the house, cold and clean looking. She had the purification tablets she had bought at the county store the previous afternoon. Water was solvable. The raccoons she discovered were less interested in confrontation than in their own continued comfort. By mid-morning, with sufficient human activity and noise filling the space they had occupied undisturbed for years, they retreated through the ceiling gap and did not return that day. Martha immediately stuffed the gap with a folded tarp and branches. She felt no particular triumph about this. The raccoons had simply made a practical decision, as all sensible creatures do. Food was the most pressing problem beyond water, and food required money and money required work. She walked 5 miles out to the road along the forestry track, carrying Frank's lantern for the dark sections under the tree canopy, and found the camp supply store he had mentioned. The owner was a woman named Carol Reeves in her 50s, with the competent directness of someone who runs a business alone and has become efficient out of necessity rather than personality. She looked at Martha across the counter, the way small-town shopkeepers look at people whose circumstances they have already worked out from the evidence. "You're the woman who bought the Whitmore place," Carol said. "I am. How much have you got to spend?" Martha put $23 on the counter. She told Carol what she needed: rice-dried beans, salt matches, water purification tablets, whatever that covered. Carol assembled the order and added things without asking. A half loaf of bread from the previous day, a small block of cheese. She charged Martha $20 and waved off the difference. Then she said, "I need someone to clean the store 3 mornings a week, 5 to 8, $15 an hour cash." Martha calculated quickly. 3 days, 3 hours, $15, $135 a week. Combined with her Social Security, if she could get it forwarded to a new address, she would have just enough. "When do I start?" she asked. "Monday," Carol said, 5 o'clock. "Don't be late." Walking back with her bag of supplies and the knowledge of work beginning in 4 days, Martha felt the shape of the future become slightly less featureless. She was beginning to see the outline of what survival looked like. It looked like this: one practical problem solved at a time in the order of their urgency without spending energy on what could not be changed. The next weeks established a rhythm that was brutal and clarifying in equal measure. 3 mornings a week she woke at 3:30, walked 5 miles through the forest, dark to Carol's store, worked from 5 to 8, walked 5 miles back, and worked on the house until the light was gone. 4 days a week she worked on the house from first light to last. She ate simply rice and beans and whatever Carol left over that could not be sold, supplemented with things she found in the forest once she learned what to look for. She taught herself as she went, which is the oldest and most reliable method. Her hands changed in the first 2 weeks. The hands she had arrived with were the hands of a woman who had kept a house and gardened and sewed for 40 years, which is not nothing, which is in fact a great deal, but which had not produced calluses in the places that appear when you carry stones or work wet clay with bare fingers in November cold. She watched the calluses form with a kind of detached interest. Her back, which had ached constantly in the first week, stopped aching. Her shoulders, which had been stiff since the morning she had packed 40 years into 2 cardboard boxes, began to settle differently, lower and more grounded. She was becoming, again, someone she recognized from a long time ago. Robert had always said that work revealed character the way weather revealed the quality of a building. You did not know what you had built until you tested it. She was testing now, and what she was finding was more than she had expected to find. The windows were first. She could not afford glass, but she could seal the openings. She gathered long, flexible branches from the forest and wove them into tight frames, then mixed clay from the creek bank with dried grass to create a thick plaster-like substance that she packed into and around the woven frames, building panels that blocked wind and rain. The first panel took most of a day. The last took 2 hours. She left deliberate gaps at the top of each panel to allow light and sealed everything with the same clay mixture once the frames had dried. It was not elegant, it was effective. The roof was harder. She had no materials to replace it properly, but she could extend its useful life. She gathered pine boughs by the hundreds, cutting them with a rusted saw she found in the debris of the shed behind the house, and layered them in overlapping rows across the worst of the damaged sections, working from the outside edges toward the center, securing them with twine. The natural pitch in the pine sealed the layers against moisture. The first time she climbed onto the roof, she was frightened. She would not have admitted it to anyone, but she had no one to admit it to, which was itself a kind of freedom. She was 70 years old and the roof was damaged in multiple places, and there was no one who would come if she fell. She moved slowly, testing each surface before trusting her weight to it, the way she had been careful on ice since the winter she was 12 and had misjudged a patch on the Maple Street sidewalk and spent 3 weeks in a cast. She reached the damaged section. She distributed the boughs. She came back down the same way she had gone up, slowly and carefully and without event. She stood on the ground afterward and felt the particular gratitude of a woman who has done a thing she was afraid of and is still standing. It was not a large thing. It was a roof, but it was her roof and she had taken care of it with her own hands. When the first rain came, she stood inside and watched with her lantern, marking every drip with chalk. The next day, she patched every mark. The floor had sections rotted through where years of water had found the boards beneath the broken windows. She gathered flat stones from the creek and set them in the worst gaps, mortaring them in place with clay and ash mixed to a stiff paste. She worked on her knees with her hands in the cold clay, fitting each stone to the available space, building up the mortar level with the surrounding boards. The stones were not beautiful, they were solid. Robert had always said that beautiful was a bonus and solid was the requirement, and she had agreed with him then and agreed with him more now. The stove was her greatest project and her greatest victory in those first weeks. It was a cast iron wood burner from the 1870s, rusted and cold, and apparently forgotten. But when she examined it carefully, she found that the basic structure was intact. She spent 3 days cleaning the rust from every accessible surface with creek stones and old metal she found in the debris, then sealed the joints with a mixture of ash and clay that she had read about in a small book on traditional building techniques she found improbably and wonderfully on the shelf above the table. The book was old and water-damaged at the edges, but legible, and it told her more than she had expected to need to know about materials and methods that predated the 20th century. The first fire in the restored stove produced smoke that filled the room within minutes. She went outside, coughing, and assessed. The flue was blocked. She got onto the roof, moving carefully along the ridge with the particular caution of a woman who knows she cannot afford an injury, and cleared the blockage with a long birch branch. She climbed back down and tried again. The second fire burned. The heat was immediate and disproportionate to the small amount of wood she had used, the particular generous warmth of cast iron that has been properly attended to and given fuel. Martha sat on the floor in front of the stove with her back against the wall and her hands wrapped around a tin cup of hot water, and felt the warmth move into her from the outside, in which is the only direction warmth can travel. She wrote in the notebook, "Stove working. Robert always said cast iron was worth twice what it cost if you treated it right." He was right as usual. Frank Morrison came by every week with something he called surplus: a wool blanket, a kerosene lamp, a better saw, a small hand plane, a bag of nails. Martha accepted each thing with straightforward gratitude and without protest, because she had learned in the first weeks that the pride that refuses practical help in difficult circumstances is a luxury available only to people who can afford it, and she could not. Over coffee on one of his visits, Frank said, "People in town are talking about you. Some of them thought you'd be gone by the first hard freeze." "What do they say now?" Martha asked. Frank smiled. "They say you're still there." "That's enough," Martha said. In the middle of December, a letter was forwarded to her through the county record system, which listed her new property address as her address of record. The return address was Michael's law firm. It was not a personal letter. It was a formal communication advising her that the sale of the Maple Street house had been completed, and that in consideration of her circumstances, a room had been reserved in her name at Sunrise Gardens beginning January 1st. The cost would be covered by proceeds from the sale. She was welcome to move in at her convenience. They hoped she was well. Martha read the letter twice. Then she used it to start the evening fire. It caught easily and burned with a particular clean efficiency of good paper. She wrote in her notebook, "They think I will come back. I will not come back." She sat by the stove after writing this and thought about what it meant that the letter had not affected her the way she might have expected. She had anticipated anger or grief, or the cold ache of betrayal revisited. What she felt instead was something closer to clarity. The letter had been written by people who believed she would eventually accept the situation they had arranged for her. They did not understand that she had already built something different and would not stop building it. December brought cold that settled into everything and stayed. The thermometer Frank had installed outside the door read 7 degrees on the morning of the winter solstice. Martha managed the stove with the precision of someone who has learned that fuel is finite and warmth is earned, adding wood in measured amounts, maintaining the fire at the level required rather than the level that would have been comfortable. She was learning economy in this way, the particular discipline of a person who has exactly what they need and must use it carefully. A week before Christmas, a storm came that sealed the road for 3 days. No one could reach her. Frank did not come. Carol's store was unreachable. Martha was completely alone with the house in the forest and the sound of wind in the pines. She had been afraid that this kind of isolation would be difficult. She had been wrong. The 3 days of the storm were some of the most internally spacious days she had experienced in years. Without the external rhythm of the morning walks and the work at Carol's and Frank's visits, she found herself in a silence that was simply itself not threatening, not lonely in the way she had feared, but honest. There was nothing between her and her own thoughts. There had not been this kind of space around her interior life since before Robert's illness, when the daily urgency of caring for someone dying had filled every moment. She used the 3 days well. She read the Whitmore journals in their entirety for the first time from first entry to last. She read about his arrival in Vermont, his choice of this particular piece of land, his construction of the cottage, his 4 years of solitary work. She read about his declining health described with the same careful objectivity he brought to botanical observation and about his decision to hide his work. She read the final entry written in October of 1874. I am satisfied, not with the incompleteness of the work which I regret, but with the quality of what has been accomplished. I have seen things here that have not been seen before and recorded them faithfully. What I have done is real. I need nothing else from it. Martha sat with that sentence for a long time by the fire. She thought he had nothing at the end except his work and his conviction that it mattered. And it had. It had waited 150 years to matter. She wrote in the notebook on the second night of the storm, I do not know when I stopped believing that what I did had value and apart from what other people told me it was worth. I think it was gradual. I think I needed to come here to remember that the value of a thing is not determined by who acknowledges it. Robert knew this. He built furniture for 40 years, and he cared about each piece regardless of whether the buyer noticed the joinery. I always admired that. I am applying it now. Christmas came and went. Frank brought a small pine branch and a bottle of cider. Carol brought a package of coffee and a bag of sugar and a battery-powered radio, which turned out to be one of the most practical gifts Martha had ever received, because the voices from the radio filled the evenings in a way that made the silence less heavy without requiring anything from her in return. She decorated the pine branch with strips cut from a worn-out blouse and felt the particular foolish happiness of small decorations in difficult circumstances, which is one of the most resilient forms of happiness there is. I'm not trying to survive, she wrote in the notebook on Christmas Eve. I'm trying to live. In late December, working on the ceiling of the main room, Martha found what Thomas Whitmore had left behind. She had noticed several days earlier that one section of the ceiling boards looked different from the others. Slightly less water damaged, slightly cleaner, as though they had been protected somehow, while the rest of the ceiling accumulated the evidence of decades. She had been meaning to investigate more carefully, and on a clear afternoon when the light was good, she finally did. She used the small crowbar Frank had left her to pry up the edge of one board. Then another. The wood was old and dry and came away cleanly. Behind it was a gap between the ceiling boards and the roof structure, which was normal in old construction of this type used as insulation. But in this particular gap, tucked against the central beam and wrapped in what had once been oilcloth, was a wooden crate, square about 2 feet on each side, heavier than she expected when she pulled it carefully down. Burned into the wood on the side with a branding iron or a hot tool of some kind, TWID 1871. Martha set the crate on the table and looked at it for a long moment. The oilcloth wrapping was mostly rotted away, but the crate itself was intact. The joints were tight. Whoever had made it to last. She opened it carefully. Inside, wrapped in layers of the same oilcloth, were 6 leather-bound journals. Old paper, dry and fragile at the edges but largely intact. Botanical specimens pressed and mounted between sheets of heavy paper, each one labeled in precise handwriting with Latin names and collection dates. Detailed drawings of plants and animals and landscapes rendered with the meticulous accuracy of a scientist who was also undeniably an artist. Martha lifted out the first journal and opened it to the first page. The inscription read, Thomas Whitmore Field Notes, New England Flora, June 1871 to November 1871. She turned pages carefully. The entries were dense and precise, the observations of a man who understood what he was looking at and knew how to record what he saw. Notes on plant behavior and seasonal change and the relationships between species. Observations about medicinal properties. Careful diagrams of root structures and seed dispersal. The handwriting was steady and assured the handwriting of someone who wrote every day and expected to be read. One entry near the back of the first journal caught her eye and held it. This land provides everything a naturalist could hope for. Species I have never seen documented anywhere. Plants with properties unknown to modern science. I have built my cottage here to continue my work away from the interference of those who would commercialize my discoveries. Here I can study nature in her purest form. I fear my health is failing, but I am content. My work will survive me. I have hidden my journals and specimens where they will be safe until someone worthy finds them. Martha sat back in the chair Robert had not built, but that felt like something he would have approved of, solid and uncomplicated, and read the entry again. Thomas Whitmore. She reached for the memory that had been circling at the edge of her attention since she first saw the name on the property deed. She had seen it somewhere, not recently, years ago perhaps, or in passing, in the kind of context that does not demand retention, but deposits something anyway. Then she had it. Carol's store had a small display case near the register, a local history tribute to the area, photographs and documents, and a few typed cards describing notable events and figures. One of the cards mentioned a British naturalist who had come to Vermont in the 1860s, built a cottage in the northern forest to pursue botanical research, and disappeared in the 1870s. His body was never found. His life's work was believed to have been lost with him. Thomas Whitmore. Martha looked at the crate on the table, at the 6 journals, at the hundreds of botanical specimens preserved and labeled, at the drawings. She was not living in a condemned ruin in the Vermont woods. She was living in the last known home of a famous naturalist whose work had been considered lost for 150 years. And she had just found it. She wrote in the notebook in the margin beside her survival list, day 47, I found him. January brought temperatures that had no interest in what Martha Jenkins needed them to be. The thermometer Frank had installed on the outside of the door frame read 8 degrees Fahrenheit on the 4th morning of the new year. The stove ran continuously. The clay and branch window panels held against the wind, which was something she had not been entirely certain of until she tested them against the first real winter the house had seen in 15 years of abandonment. They held. The seams were tight. Robert would have approved of the method if not the materials, and she suspected he would have found the materials interesting. She managed everything with the precision of someone who has learned that sufficiency requires attention. Not excess, not comfort, not the easy abundance of a life with slack in it, but exactly what each situation required, used fully and without waste. She had learned this the hard way, which is the only way certain lessons lodge deeply enough to change how you move through the world. The journals and the specimens sat on the shelf above the stove, the warmest and driest location in the house, covered with a clean piece of canvas she had cut from a tarp. She handled them carefully when she read from them in the evenings, with clean hands, replacing everything in the order she had found it. They had waited 150 years. They deserved care. She did not know yet what to do with them. She knew she needed someone qualified to tell her what they were exactly and what they meant. She knew she could not do this alone. Frank knew someone. He mentioned it in early January on one of his weekly visits with the offhand precision of a man who has been thinking about something for a while and has finally decided to say it. He said there was a botanist at the University of Vermont, a woman named Dr. Patricia Chen, who specialized in historical plant studies and had written about naturalists of the 19th century. He had a colleague who knew her. Carol could make a call. Tell Carol to make the call, Martha said. Frank nodded and left. Martha went back to refinishing the floor with the linseed oil she had bought at Carol's store, working in long, patient strokes from the wall, inward, following the grain of the old wood, the way Robert had always followed grain, because it was the only way to get a result that would last. She had begun to think about Thomas Whitmore differently than she had in the first weeks after the discovery. In the beginning, he had been a mystery, a name on a crate, a reason the house might be more than it appeared. Now, after weeks of reading his journals by firelight, he had become someone she felt she knew, in the particular way that you know someone whose thinking you have spent time inside. Whitmore had come to Vermont for the same reason she had come to this house, though his circumstances were different, because he needed a place where the work he cared about could be done without interference. He had built the cottage himself. He had stocked it with what he needed. He had worked through the winters in the isolation with the focused attention of a person who has decided that what they are doing matters more than comfort. He had written in the 4th journal an entry that Martha had read 3 times and thought about more than any other. I am told frequently that the conditions here are unsuitable for a man of my age and training. I am 53 years old and in deteriorating health and living in the forest of northern Vermont in circumstances that my colleagues in London would consider barbaric. They are not wrong about the conditions. They are entirely wrong about the conclusion. I have never been more certain that I am doing exactly what I am supposed to be doing. Martha had read that entry the first time and recognized something in it that she could not have named precisely. She had read it the second time and understood that what she recognized was herself. She had read it the third time, and written in the margin of her notebook, he understood. Dr. Patricia Chen arrived on a Tuesday morning in the last week of January, driving a small car that had been recently washed but not recently warmed, and arrived with the slightly guarded expression of a scientist who has been told something remarkable and has trained herself not to expect remarkable things to be what they are claimed to be. She stood in the doorway for a moment before entering and took in the space. The restored stove, the clay panel windows, the floor that had been cleaned and partially refinished, the shelf where the crate sat wrapped in canvas. She looked at all of it with the careful attention of a professional who is revising her initial assessment in real time. "You've been living here since November," she said. "I have," Martha said. "Alone. Alone." Dr. Chen looked at the floor where the flat creek stones mortared into the repaired gaps were visible near the base of the north wall. She looked at the window panels precisely fitted to frames that must have been in difficult condition when the work began. She looked at the stove, clean and burning steadily, in a building that had been condemned as uninhabitable 3 months ago. "How?" she said, and the question was genuine. "One thing at a time," Martha said, in the order they needed doing. The guardedness lasted less than 5 minutes. Martha set the crate on the table and stepped back. Dr. Chen examined the journals with hands that moved carefully and with the reverence of someone who understands what she is touching. She studied the specimens with a magnifying glass, cross-referencing her own reference materials. She read 3 consecutive entries in the second journal and then sat back and looked at Martha with an expression that was no longer guarded at all. "Mrs. Jenkins," she said, "do you understand what you found?" "I think so," Martha said, "but I'd like you to explain it properly." Dr. Chen spent the next hour doing exactly that. She explained that Thomas Whitmore had been one of the leading naturalists of his generation, a figure whose disappearance had been mourned in botanical circles for a century and a half. His work had been cut short by his death, or assumed death, before he could publish the discoveries he had made in Vermont. Those discoveries had been considered permanently lost. Until now, Dr. Chen said. She explained that several of the specimens in the crate appeared to be from plant species that had been declared extinct in Vermont in the 1920s due to habitat loss and development. If the specimens were authentic, they would be the only preserved examples in existence. She explained that Whitmore's field observations about plant behavior and seasonal change made from this specific location over 4 years in the 1870s would provide a baseline for climate change research that no other data source could replicate. She explained that his notes on medicinal plant properties anticipated discoveries in botanical pharmacology by decades. "What happens now?" Martha asked. "Several things," Dr. Chen said. "The materials need to be properly archived and preserved. They should be in climate-controlled conditions, digitized, made accessible to researchers. The house needs to be evaluated by historical preservation specialists. If this was Whitmore's residence, and everything here suggests it was, it should be protected and likely restored." "Would I have to give up the house?" Martha asked. This was the question underneath all the other questions. "No," Dr. Chen said without hesitation. "You own this property. Anything done here would require your full participation and consent. In fact, if the state declares this a historical site, there would be funding available for restoration. You could remain here as the site's caretaker." She paused. "More than that, you could be its guardian. Thomas Whitmore's work was lost for 150 years. You found it. You preserved it. That makes you part of the story, Mrs. Jenkins." Martha sat with this for a moment. She looked at the table where the journals and specimens had waited in their canvas-wrapped crate for someone to open them. "I want Dr. Chen to see everything," she said. "But she comes here. Nothing leaves this house without my permission." Dr. Chen smiled. "I wouldn't have it any other way." The process that followed moved through institutional time, which is slower and more deliberate than the time of a woman surviving a Vermont winter, but which eventually, with sufficient evidence and the right advocates, produces results. Dr. Chen submitted documentation to the Vermont Historical Society within the week of her first visit with a report that described the Whitmore collection as the most significant botanical historical discovery in New England in the past 3 decades. She contacted colleagues at Harvard's Botany Department and at the Smithsonian Institution's Natural History Division. She sent photographs of the pressed specimens to a specialist in 19th century plant taxonomy at Cornell, who responded within 48 hours with an email that used the words extraordinary and unprecedented in the same sentence. Martha was not present for most of these communications. She was working. She refinished the floor with linseed oil and repaired a section of the north wall where the original chinking had failed. She built a proper wood rack outside the back door from timber salvaged from the old shed. She started reading every botanical reference she could find at the library in Burlington, 5 miles out and 5 miles back on the days she worked at Carol's store, so that when researchers came to study the Whitmore materials, she would be able to understand what they were looking at and speak to them with something more than good intentions. She was becoming, without fully realizing it, the curator that the site would need. Dr. Chen worked with the Vermont Historical Society to verify the significance of the discovery. A graduate student named Elise came for 3 weeks in March to photograph and catalog every page of every journal, every mounted specimen, every drawing. She worked at Martha's table in cotton gloves with the focused intensity of someone who has recently understood that the thing they are studying is historically real in ways that coursework had not quite prepared them for. On her last day, standing at the door with her coat on and her bags in the car, Elise said, "Dr. Chen told me you found all of this while you were repairing the ceiling." "I was replacing some boards that had water damage," Martha said. "You bought this house for $5, and it had the most significant cache of 19th century botanical field research in the northeastern United States hidden in the ceiling." Elise shook her head slowly. "And you were here because you had nowhere else to go." "That's accurate," Martha said. Elise was quiet for a moment. Whitmore wrote that he'd hidden his work where it would be safe until someone worthy found it. She looked at Martha. "I think he meant someone exactly like you." Martha thought about this after Elise drove away. She thought about a man who had built a house in the Vermont woods and worked alone in it until his health failed, and had hidden his life's work in the ceiling of that house and trusted that what was true would eventually find the person who needed to know it was true. She thought about a 70-year-old woman with a cardboard suitcase and $56 who had sat on a sidewalk in November and picked up a newspaper from a trash can. She was not a person who believed in fate exactly, but she believed in the particular kind of precise fit that occurs sometimes between a problem and the person best equipped to solve it, and she recognized that she was standing inside one. In April of 2020, the cottage at 1847 Timber Ridge Road, Burlington, Vermont, was entered into the National Register of Historic Places as the Whitmore Cottage, circa 1870 residence and research site of naturalist Thomas W. Whitmore. The designation came with a letter from the National Park Service addressed to Martha Eleanor Jenkins as the property owner of record. She read it at the table in the main room on a morning in late April when the last of the snow had finally cleared from the clearing and the first green was visible in the tree line. She set the letter down and looked out the window, which now had glass in it, period-appropriate glazing, installed during the first round of restoration work. Then she looked at the table, Whitmore's original table, cleaned and stabilized and still standing exactly where it had stood for 150 years. She wrote in the notebook, April, "It's official, it's mine, and it's his, and it's part of the record now." He waited long enough. The University of Vermont contacted her through Dr. Chen and offered a formal arrangement, site caretaker and primary liaison for the Whitmore collection, a monthly stipend of $800, the right to reside at the property permanently as long as she wished to serve in the role. Combined with her Social Security, she was now earning more each month than she had spent in her last 2 years in the house on Maple Street. She signed the contract at Carol's store counter, with Carol and Frank both present. Neither of them made any particular ceremony of it, which was exactly the right response. The restoration work began in May. The team that arrived was led by a preservation architect in her early 40s named Rachel Ford, methodical and precise with the particular way of looking at old structures that comes from years of learning to read what buildings are trying to say. She walked through the cottage with Martha on the first morning, and within the first 30 minutes, it was clear to both of them that the woman who had been living here since November had done something unexpected. Rachel stopped at the window panels, the ones Martha had made from woven branches and clay in November. She touched the edge where the panel met the original frame. "You fitted these to the existing frame," she said. "You didn't disturb the original woodwork." "The original framing is still sound," Martha said. "Disturbing it would have been the wrong decision." Rachel studied her. "Where did you learn to make adobe panels?" "I found a book," Martha said, "and I had no other materials." Rachel wrote something in her notebook. Then she said, "The technique you used is more consistent with period-appropriate preservation practice than most contracted restoration work I've seen. The clay mixture, the integration with the existing frame. You've essentially done the first phase of conservation work without knowing that's what it was called." "I just needed to keep the wind out." Martha said. Yes, Rachel said. And you did it in a way that didn't damage what was already there, which is the entire point of preservation work. The full restoration took 3 months. Rachel's crew arrived each morning at 7 and worked steadily until 5, and Martha worked alongside them, not because she was required to, but because the house was hers, and she wanted to understand everything that was being done to it. Rachel allowed this without comment. Within the first week, it was clear to both of them that Martha had opinions about the work that were worth hearing, and that those opinions were grounded in 6 months of living in the structure and understanding what it needed. When the crew proposed replacing the floor section near the north wall with new pine boards, Martha said no. She said the original boards had survived because they were old-growth timber, tighter grained, and more durable than any modern replacement, and that a careful repair was preferable to a replacement that would not match. Rachel agreed. A carpenter on the crew spent 2 days doing the repair that Martha recommended, and it was, as Martha had predicted, indistinguishable from the original once finished. When the roofers suggested a particular grade of cedar shingle, Martha asked Rachel to check against Whitmore's description of the original roof in the third journal, where he had noted the material and the installation angle with the same precision he brought to botanical specimens. The shingles that were finally ordered matched his description. Working on the restoration of a house she had first repaired with clay and creek stones and pine branches, Martha understood something about the relationship between emergency work and proper work. They were not opposites. The emergency repairs had been guided by the same principles as the proper ones. Use has what is available, respect what is already there, make it hold. The methods had been cruder, but the thinking had been the same. Rachel confirmed this when she filed the project documentation, noting that the emergency preservation work of the preceding winter had set the standard for everything that followed. The summer of 2020 brought researchers to the cottage regularly, each arriving with questions and leaving with more. A professor from Harvard came in June and spent a week in the collection. A climate scientist from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration came in July, interested in Whitmore's century-old weather observations as a baseline for modeling. 2 graduate students from Cornell came in August to study the pressed specimens. Martha guided all of them. She had spent the spring reading every botanical reference. Dr. Chen had recommended not to become a scientist herself, but to understand the collection well enough to be useful to the scientists who came to study it. She could explain the significance of each specimen, the location where it had been collected, the properties Whitmore had noted, the reason it mattered to researchers 150 years later. She did this in the plain language of a woman who had learned by paying attention rather than by formal training, and the researchers found this without exception more useful than they expected. One afternoon in late July, the climate scientist sat back from his laptop and looked at Martha across the table. "You've read all 6 journals," he said. "Several times," she said. "Do you understand what he was recording in the third journal, the phenological data?" "The seasonal timing of the plants," Martha said. "First blooms last, fruiting the intervals between." He was mapping how the forest organized itself across the year. The scientist was quiet for a moment. "That data from 1871 to 1874 from this specific location is essentially irreplaceable for our purposes. There's nothing else like it in the northeastern United States at this scale and precision." He looked at the display case with the journals, and it was sitting in a ceiling. "It was sitting in a ceiling," Martha agreed. The full restoration concluded in late August. The roof was replaced with hand-split cedar shingles matched to the period. The foundation was repointed. The framing was stabilized. Electrical and plumbing were installed through interior chases designed to be removable without disturbing the original fabric. Martha's clay window panels were documented, photographed, and then carefully removed and preserved as interpretive objects for the site's collection, replaced with period-appropriate glazed sash. The Whitmore crate was rehomed to a purpose-built display cabinet, climate-controlled with a glass front. The journals were mounted in archival-grade display cases along the north wall, each one open to a significant page, the botanical drawings visible beneath their archival glazing, each one labeled with the date and location of the specimens described. Beneath each journal, a small card in text readable from across the room: Thomas W. Whitmore Field Notes, Vermont, 1871. Discovered 2019 by Martha E. Jenkins, site curator. Rachel arranged, without being asked, for an interpretive panel near the entrance that told the story of the cottage and its discoverer in language for visitors who might not immediately understand the scientific significance of what they were seeing, but could understand that a man had done important work, had hidden it in a wall. He built himself and had been proven right a century and a half later by a woman who arrived with $5 and determination and a very good reason to pay attention to what was hidden in the bones of things. Martha read the panel when Rachel showed it to her for approval. She made one correction, a date that was off by a year. Rachel made the change without comment. Martha approved the rest as written. On November 15th, 2020, exactly 1 year after Martha had stood on a sidewalk with a cardboard suitcase and $56, the cottage was complete. The date was not a coincidence. Frank had suggested it, and Martha had agreed immediately because she understood what he understood, that the story needed a shape, and the shape of a year completed was the right shape. Frank organized a small gathering. Carol brought a pie from a recipe she had made for her own mother and had not made sense, which meant something that didn't need to be stated. Dr. Chen arrived with several colleagues from the university who had been working with the Whitmore materials throughout the year. Rachel Ford came with 2 members of her restoration crew. A representative from the Vermont Historical Society came from Montpelier. The climate scientist from NOAA came down from Burlington. The Harvard professor came from Cambridge. Several people from the surrounding community arrived, the kind of people who exist in small Vermont towns as the connective tissue between events present at everything that matters known by first name, understood to belong. Martha stood at the door of the cottage she had bought for $5 and repaired with her own hands and watched people come in. The cottage held them all. It was warm from the wood stove and bright from the window light and smelled of cedar from the new shingles and linseed oil from the refinished floor. It was exactly what it was supposed to be. Dr. Chen gave a short speech. She spoke about Thomas Whitmore's contribution to botanical science, now formally documented and entering the permanent record. She spoke about the species preserved in his collection that had been declared extinct and what it meant for current research to have physical specimens from 150 years ago. She spoke about Whitmore's phenological observations and what they meant for climate science. She spoke about his drawings, which had been assessed by an art historian at Yale and described as among the finest examples of scientific illustration produced in the 19th century American Northeast. She spoke about the injustice of a life's work lost in the long chain of circumstances that had recovered it. Then she paused, and in the pause, the room became very quiet, and she said something that stopped the room entirely. She said that in the course of her research over the preceding year, she had located Whitmore's personal correspondence at a university archive in England, the archive of the colleague he had written to most frequently from Vermont. In a letter written in October of 1871, 4 months before he disappeared, Whitmore had written about his decision to hide his journals and specimens in the cottage. He had written, "I am not long for this work, but the work will outlast me if I am careful about where I place it. I have built the hiding place with my own hands, and I am satisfied it will hold. Whoever finds it will find it because they were the right person to look in the right place at the right moment. I have faith in that kind of precision." Dr. Chen let the words settle. Then she said he was right. The hiding place had held for 148 years, and the right person had looked in the right place at the right moment. She looked at Martha when she said this. Several other people in the room looked at Martha. Martha looked at the journals in their archival cases on the wall and did not say anything. She was thinking about the afternoon she had found the crate, about the way the ceiling boards had looked slightly different from the others, slightly less damaged, as if they had been attended to. About the way she had noticed this, not because she was looking for anything in particular, but because she had spent weeks looking at every surface of the house with close attention, learning what it was and what it needed. She was thinking about a woman who had been called a burden and thrown away, and who had arrived at a condemned house with $5 and no plan, and had noticed things, which was what she had always done, which was what she would always do. He had been right. The hiding place had held, and the right person had found it. Frank, standing near the back of the room, raised his hard cider cup. He did not say anything. He did not need to say anything. Several people raised theirs in response, and that was the ceremony complete and sufficient, the way ceremonies are when the people conducting them are not performing, but simply acknowledging something that is already real. Martha raised her cup. She drank. She set it down. She was thinking about what it meant that the person who had found Whitmore's work was a 70-year-old woman who had been called a burden and left on a sidewalk with less than $60. She was thinking about how the most useful things sometimes wait for the most unlikely circumstances to deliver them to the right person. She was thinking about Thomas Whitmore in this room 150 years ago, working through his declining health with the focused attention of someone who has decided that the work matters more than the circumstances. She thought he trusted something he could not see, and he was right to. Michael and Susan arrived 3 days later. Martha was in the garden when she heard the car, an expensive SUV, that moved carefully on the unpaved section of Timber Ridge Road. She had started the garden in the spring learning, as she planted what grew well in a cleared Vermont forest, and what did not, keeping notes in the small notebook that had gradually shifted from survival list to something that looked more like a record of a life being deliberately built. She had grown tomatoes which had done better than she expected, and kale which had done well from the start, and beans which she was harvesting, now pulling the dried pods from the vine with the brisk efficiency of a woman who has learned not to leave work for tomorrow that can be done today. The garden had been Robert's gift in this last form, the knowledge he had passed to her across 40 years of watching him tend their garden on Maple Street. She had not known she retained it so completely until she needed it. She stood up from the garden bed and took off her gloves and waited. She did not go to meet them. She had not spoken to her children in a year. She had not sought contact, and they had not offered it until the story of the Whitmore discovery had appeared in the Vermont newspapers and then briefly in the national press. She had understood from the moment she saw the SUV on the road that they had come because of the coverage. That was all right. She had been expecting this, and she was ready for it. She had thought about what she wanted to say to her children for most of the preceding year, in the way that you think about important conversations you know are coming, not rehearsing exactly, but understanding your own position clearly enough that when the moment arrived, you would not be surprised by yourself. She was not angry. She had been angry, and the anger had done its work, had carried her through the worst weeks of the first winter, and then it had burned down to ash the way all things burn down eventually, and what was left beneath it was clearer and less volatile and more useful. Michael and Susan got out of the car together, both dressed in the careful, casual clothing of people who have planned an outfit for a situation they expect to be emotionally significant. They took in the restored cottage, the historical marker, the maintained grounds, with expressions that moved through surprise and calculation in approximately equal measure. "Mom," Michael said, and his voice carried the forced warmth of a man who has rehearsed his opening. "We've been looking for you." "Have you?" Martha said. "For how long?" "Since the article in the paper," Susan said, and had the grace to hear how that sounded before it finished coming out of her mouth. Martha waited. Michael said they had been worried. He said they had made decisions that, in retrospect, they wished they had made differently. He said they were family. He said the cottage was obviously extraordinary, clearly valuable, clearly something that should be handled carefully. He said it looked like it could be quite a significant property now, historically speaking. He said there were probably decisions to be made about its future. He said they wanted to be part of those decisions, to be helpful, to be family. Martha listened to all of it. She had always believed in letting people finish. Then she said, "When exactly did you start worrying about me?" Michael's expression shifted. "That's not, was it when the newspaper article ran or the national press pickup? Because for the year before that, I did not hear from either of you." She held up her hands, the hands she had used to seal windows with clay and repair a stove with ash and clear a ruined house of decades of debris. "These hands built this, not you. Frank Morrison helped me, and Carol Reeves gave me work when I had nothing, and Dr. Chen recognized what I had found and helped me protect it. None of you were here for any of that." Susan said, "Mom, we're sorry. We made a terrible mistake." "Yes," Martha said, "you did." "Can't we?" Susan began. "I'm going to tell you something I've thought about for a year," Martha said. "Not to hurt you, because it's true and you deserve to hear the truth from me before you hear it from yourself eventually. You called me a burden. You took the house your father left me and you sold it. You left me on a sidewalk in November with less than $60 and a broken suitcase. I'm not angry at you for this anymore. I was angry for a long time, and then I was too busy to be angry, and then the anger became something quieter and more honest. What I understand now is that you made the decision you thought you needed to make for your own reasons, and that you told yourselves it was for my benefit because that was easier than telling yourselves the truth." Neither of her children spoke. "The house on Maple Street is gone," Martha continued. "I can't get that back, and I wouldn't try. But this house, this one I built, I saved it with my own hands. I found what was hidden in it. I made it mean something. And it is mine in a way that no house ever was before because I did not inherit it or have it given to me. I earned it. She looked at them steadily. It's not for sale. It will never be for sale. When I die, it goes to the Vermont Historical Society with the condition that it remain a historical site. You are not in my will. What I have will go to Frank and Carol and Patricia, the people who were here. Michael started to say something, stopped. Susan said quietly, is there anything we can do? You can come back, Martha said. Not today, not to have this conversation again. But if you want to rebuild something, the road is passable. 10 months out of 12, and I am here. They stood with that for a moment. Then Michael nodded once and walked back to the car. Susan looked at her mother for a long time with an expression that Martha recognized as the beginning of something that would take years to become what it was trying to become. We're sorry, Susan said. I know, Martha said. Goodbye, Susan. The SUV reversed out and disappeared through the trees. Frank appeared from inside the cottage where he had been reseating a hinge that had been sticking. He had stayed out of sight with the deliberate tact of a man who understood when his presence was not needed. You all right? He asked. I'm better than all right, Martha said, and meant it precisely. She went back to the garden. There were still autumn vegetables to harvest, and the work was useful and concrete and real, which was what she needed after the kind of conversation that asks more of you than it appears to. 3 weeks later, Susan came back alone. She drove the older car and arrived at 11 on a Saturday morning with 2 coffees from the cafe in town, which meant she had been on the road since before 8. She stood outside the door and said simply, Mom. Martha looked at her daughter in the doorway. Susan looked different from the woman who had arrived 3 weeks ago with Michael in the careful outfit and the prepared expression. She looked tired, and the tiredness was honest rather than performed. She was holding the coffees with both hands the way people hold things when they are not sure what to do with their hands. Martha opened the door. Come in. They sat at Whitmore's table in the restored main room and drank the coffee while the wood stove produced its steady heat and the late October light came through the old glass windows and lay in long angles across the clean floor. The room was quiet in the particular way of rooms that have been properly attended to a quality of settled peace rather than absence. Susan looked at everything. She looked a long time at the journals in their archival cases, at the botanical drawings framed on the wall. She looked at the clay window panels preserved and mounted as part of the site's collection, and Martha watched her realize what she was looking, the work of her mother's hands, in the worst winter of her life, now preserved and labeled as historically significant. You made those, Susan said, when you got here, before the restoration. I needed to keep the wind out, Martha said, and now they're in a museum. They're in the house, Martha said. That's different from a museum. Susan was quiet with this for a moment. Then she said, you really did all of this. The first 7 months were mostly survival, Martha said. After that, it became something else. What was it like the first months? Martha considered this honestly the way she considered everything honestly now, as a discipline rather than an effort. Cold, she said, and clarifying. There was nothing between me and what I was actually capable of. I had been afraid, I think, for a long time of discovering what that was. It turned out to be more than I expected. Susan wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. I'm sorry for what we did, she said. I've been sorry since before we did it, if I'm being honest. I knew it wasn't right. I let Michael talk me into the framework that made it seem practical rather than cruel, and I knew while I was doing it that I was doing that, and I did it anyway. She looked at her mother. I don't have a good explanation for that. No, Martha said. There isn't one. I know. They sat with that for a while. Outside, a crow called from the tree line and was answered by another, and the wood stove made the quiet, even sound of fire doing its work. Michael is getting help, Susan said finally. Financial counseling. He's going to have to restructure a lot of things. It's going to take years. She paused. He's ashamed, more than he shows. That's between him and his conscience, Martha said. I have no advice for him. I know. Susan looked at the botanical drawings on the wall. What he did to you and what I did to you, those were separate things. I want you to know I understand that. Martha looked at her daughter. Susan was 42 years old and had her father's eyes and her grandmother's stubbornness and her own particular way of arriving at honesty through the circuitous route of avoidance, and then finally the direct one. Martha had always known she would get there eventually. I know, Martha said. Susan asked the question that had been in her expression since she arrived. What would Dad say if he could see you now? Martha looked out the window at the clearing, the same clearing that Whitmore had kept for 4 years in the 1870s. The same trees around it that had been saplings, then the same creek running behind the slope that had given her water in her first weeks when she had nothing else. He would say, "I finally learned what he was always trying to teach me," Martha said, "that the bones are what matter, that if the bones are good, the rest is just work." Susan's eyes filled. "I miss him too," she said. "I know you do," Martha said. They sat with that for a long time, two women in a restored cottage in the Vermont woods, with the whole complicated weight of what they were to each other held quietly between them, not resolved, not healed, but present and acknowledged, which is where all real things must begin. When Susan left that afternoon, Martha stood in the doorway and watched her car find the road through the trees. She stood there for a moment after the sound of the engine faded. She thought about what it meant to be a mother. She had thought about this many times in the past year, in the particular way you think about something when all the familiar assumptions about it have been removed and you are left with only the actual thing. She had been a mother for 45 years. She had given her children everything she had, and they had taken more than she had offered. She had been angry about this, and then she had been too busy to be angry, and now she was something that was neither angry nor resigned, but simply clear she loved her children because they were her children, and because love of that kind does not dissolve when it is abused, only when it is decided to let it. She had not decided to let it, but she did not need their approval. She had learned in a condemned house in a Vermont winter that her worth was not located in other people's assessment of it. It was located in what she did with her hands and her mind and the time she was given. It always had been. She had just needed to come here to understand that clearly. She went back inside and put the kettle on. In November of 2021, on the occasion of Martha Jenkins' 72nd birthday, Dr. Patricia Chen arrived at the Whitmore cottage with a gift she had been preparing for several months. It was a printed copy of the cover page of the current issue of Historical Botany, a peer-reviewed